moving on to the video component, there was a few things that I learned having to do with the frame rate, the aperture, the ISO. The idea is basically understanding what the camera is doing itself, and with what the camera is doing, it's all about trying to receive light, receive information, and with it trying to receive information based off of the settings and how we are adjusting the settings, that's going to have a lot of impact on what the camera can do. Now, the simplest way is to understand that ISO is the last thing that we should ever adjust. Like basically is the quick thing to adjust. But if the other settings aren't strong, ISO is going to just make more noise. So one of the issues I had with the footage that we recorded was that everything looks fuzzy, like the black walls look fuzzy, like even our face looks fuzzy. One of that has to do with the digital zoom that we're putting in on ourselves, but even the wide shot is still fuzzy. So what the deal is with that, is that ISO tries to create fake light. So it tries to create like digital light. So when something's too dark for the lens, the camera's not receiving enough light, then the camera with ISO is trying to create fake light. So what happens is you get all those aberrations, which is that fuzziness from that, because it's trying to fill it in with AI, basically, in simple terms. So if we try to adjust the camera not receiving enough light with the digital aspect, is like zooming in digitally where you start to see pixels. That's what's happening with light itself. So what we need to adjust is aperture. So aperture is how much light the camera is letting in. The lower you bring it, the camera is going to be able to receive and read more light, therefore not need the ISO so much to observe that light. But it's showing you kind of live how much light it can see, right? If that makes sense. So then once we do that, we open up that lens to receive more light. It's not going to make it brighter necessarily. It might make it darker. But then when we adjust the ISO, now it doesn't have to make as much fake light because the lens itself is letting more light in. That makes sense. So the aperture allows us to adjust the aperture, allows us to do that. But first of all, we need to make sure that with the aperture, it's based off of the frame rate. The frame rate is like how many frames, how many snapshots it's taking per second or whatever. So the frame rate, KBHD always talks about 30 FPS, frame rates per second, is the best, because anything faster than that, 60 and above, things start to look fake. The blur is gone and things look fake in that sense. And anything lower, they look too like sketchy. So 30 seems to be the best for that cinematic view. And then you set the frame rate and you double that number for the aperture. So if frame rate is set at 30, then the aperture we can set it to 160, right? So f160, I think it is. So all right, so now once we set the frame rate and the aperture, we don't change that. We don't mess around with that anymore. We leave that always as is. And then we can mess around with the ISO and adjust the light that the camera is able to read with the ISO, and therefore not being able to have that on a lower, so that the light isn't needing to be created by the computer. So now the image looks dark, but if you put that light, remember how we looked washed out? That was because the ISO was set too high and the aperture was set too low. So now when I put the light on me, it's able to capture that specific light much more clearly without creating that over saturation look, right? and then the camera lens itself is able to see that light. The ISO is able to now adjust. You can adjust the ISO so that it's at the right setting for us to look good, like our different skin tones and everything. By the way, we were onto something. The yellow light tends to be better for darker skin tones, while whiter light tends to be better for lighter skin tones. So yeah, that's in the lighting aspect. So anyways, that's all with the camera setting. Recognizing again what I said before with the camera setting is that the lighting, rather the zoom, right? When we zoom in, we're cropping into that 1080p image. So if we got 1080p, remember we said 4K is 4 times 1080p. Zooming in is like zooming in, creating a 480 or whatever, 470 into that 1080. You're just cutting off a section of pixels, which then looks pixelated and looks poor. And then no matter what, you're still going to have that fuzzy look to it because the camera simply doesn't have the ability to capture that much information. So we want to minimize the zoom as much as possible. So I was thinking about setting up the cameras for the individual shot, like face shots, much closer, like on a table, like right by us. I got some ideas for that.